Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. My name is Jeffrey Hull. I'm the Director of Global Development for the Institute of Coaching, and I am really excited to be here once again for our CoachX live conversation on LinkedIn. And today I'm particularly excited because I have a dear friend and colleague from our 100 Coaches organization, Sally Helgesen, with me. So I just want to say hello to Sally, give a little bit of her background. I'm sure many of you already know Sally and Sally's work. I have been Actually, she was on the very top of my list when I started doing this program. So I'm really excited that I was finally able to get her into the calendar. And I want to just welcome everyone from around the world. So if you're able to punch in where you are so we can see where some of you folks are coming from, it's always really exciting to get an idea where people are from all over the world. And we will also, if we can, we'll try to take as many questions as we can along the way. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Sally Helgesen, she is the best-selling author of the recent book, How Women Rise, co-authored with our dear friend and #1 coach of the world, Marshall Goldsmith. And she is more than just the author of this book, however, because I have known Sally's work for over 25 years. And in fact, I was introduced to her work back in the mid-90s when I read an amazing book that I still consider to be one of my favorites of all time, called The Web of Inclusion, a new architecture for building great organizations. I mean, really, Sally is known as one of the key thought leaders in the evolution of this idea of building a diverse and inclusive workplace. She's also the best-selling author of the book that many of you will have read called The Female Advantage, and is really considered one of the world's, if not the world's, expert thought leaders around women in the workplace and basically leveraging diversity as organizations and leaders become more and more diverse over the last 10 and 15 years. So I am thrilled to have my friend here, and I have so many questions, but I first of all just want to say hello, Sally, and welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. It's always a pleasure to be with you. So I'm very pleased you invited me onto this show and an opportunity to talk with your listeners and followers.
Well, this is a great opportunity for us, Sally, because we have coaches, and I can already see from everywhere from Boston to Florida to San Jose to Iowa to California. They're coming in from all over the world. And our audience is generally coaches or those individuals that are leaders that are interested in coaching. And so I think a good place for us to start, because I want to talk about your new book, but before we get there, we'll tease that up for folks. But before I get there, let's look at the larger arc of your career, because, you know, I think back to when I first read The Web of Inclusion and how I felt like it was truly revolutionary at that time. And I'd love, you're one of those individuals who can draw that arc over the last 20 years or so. So talk to us about what you've seen change in the C-suite and in organizations that you work with around the world in terms of leadership, in terms of where coaching fits into the picture. How have things evolved from your perspective?
It's been quite an evolution. And I would say that the biggest thing I've seen evolve, and this has been something that has really supported the kinds of ideas that were in The Female Advantage, which was published in 1990, or The Web of Inclusion as well, which was published in 1995. What I see is that we really have defined what excellence in leadership looks like. Now, that's not everywhere, but generally in organizations, well-run organizations today look for leaders who have inclusive behaviors, who are capable of listening, who recognize that they don't have every single answer in the world, who move beyond, just pure quantitative benchmarks of performance, et cetera, to be able to evaluate the culture of their organizations. So that's new. It really is. You had to be there in the 1980s and early 90s to see the extent to which this idea of the hero leader, who broke heads but got results, was viewed as what was desirable leadership in organizations. There were exceptions, of course, then. But that's what organizations mostly were looking for. That was what was exalted. That's what was on the cover of every business magazine. And that's changed. And that's been a very, very, very positive evolution. And I think we see evidence of that every day with the CEOs who came out, in support of laws that further the diversity that they're all seeking to support in their companies.
I completely agree. And what I really find interesting is I think back to the early days when I was coaching female leaders for the first time, 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago. And I remember them being asked by their bosses or by the board or whoever was, supervising, that they be more charismatic and directive and authoritative. And, in my book, I talk about this alpha style leader, and that at that time, even women were being coached. If you really want to be successful in corporate America, you have to be more like all of these famous men that we all know and love. And that always didn't feel right to me. I mean, coaching a female to become more like an authoritative leader that fits some sort of traditional archetype just never resonated with me. I mean, I was probably even ahead of my time in that I really wanted to help my female clients find their own voice. And so when I finally recently read in the last couple of years your most recent book, I was amazed. I was thinking, this is finally becoming mainstream, that women can lead not with any kind of archetypal, stereotypical way of operating, but finding their own strengths, their own talents, their own ways of leading. I'd love for you to comment on that, because it's still timely. It's still relevant today.
It's still timely, and I believe it's going to be timely and relevant for the next 20 years. It's a process that's ongoing. It's interesting, when the Female Advantage came out in 1990, I was trying to identify the great strengths of women leaders. Not that all women leaders are alike, but I was trying to look at what do really outstanding and success and influential women leaders have in common. And one of the things that was most apparent was they were very skilled at building relationships and at facilitating organizations, building cultures in which strong relationships would thrive. And when I started speaking about the book, what I heard almost every time is, okay, that's nice, but relationship building is not a leadership skill. It's a soft skill. So there's this dichotomy. It's a soft skill. This is the evolution we see now. Nobody would say that today. The capacity to build organizations that have positive, strong relationships is not considered a soft skill. It's considered an essential leadership skill. So what I've seen, and this is what's kept me going, because this hasn't always been easy, being a women's leadership, over the years I'd hear women's leadership is so 1990, but this is what's kept me going, is what I have seen is that the skills that women brought as leaders to organizations have, exactly in your words, they have gone mainstream. And this is very important for anyone who's in leadership development, talent development, coaching, to recognize and understand that this has gone mainstream, a leadership style that was considered soft or out of the mainstream. That's been a phenomenal evolution. And to me, it's always given me hope. As people say, we're not moving as fast as we could be moving, or I can't believe that in 2021, we're still talking about it. Things take time, and watching a change of that level, what I think psychologists would call a first order change like that, has been remarkable. And it's kept me very optimistic. Although, of course, anybody who would title a book in 1990, The Female Advantage, about women in work, is obviously an optimistic person to begin with.
Totally. And I mean, I remember reading in 1995, The Web of Inclusion, and thinking, wow, this is how corporate America is going to change within the next few years. And of course, it took more like 20, but it is happening and it is accelerating. And let's talk about those soft skills, because this idea that they were female skills or feminine skills, I mean, I think the pandemic has really uprooted us in a way that truly, it was already changing with your book and with others. But when you think of the skills that are really necessary for today's leaders to be effective, I'm sure you're not going to call them soft. You're going to call them absolutely essentials. Talk to us what you're finding are really the key skills these days for the leaders that you're coaching and talking to.
I think there's a big overlap right now between, and will be, and you're exactly right about the pandemic, and we can talk about that, and will continue to be between the leadership skills that define excellence today and truly inclusive behaviors. So inclusive behaviors like active listening, like waiting, a very good leadership practice to put your 2 cents in until other people have spoken, so that they're not tailoring what they say to you. Building cultures in which people communicate broadly and across levels rather than siloing information and asking for it to go up and down a chain of command. Really recognizing the value of diversity, not just tolerating it, understanding that the nature of the global talent force has profoundly changed, and that requires a different approach, because people bring not just diverse demographics to organizations, but a real diversity of skills, of values, and that needs to be recognized. And we need to create organizations that'll not just allow for that, but that can, as you say, leverage that and use it as a real strength in the marketplace. So those things are really, really important. And those were the things that I saw women excelling at in 1990 that were considered so marginal. One other thing, and this really relates to the pandemic, is that ability to integrate work and home and have a single authentic identity that enables you to meet your differing responsibilities without them being so compartmentalized. One thing that really influenced me, Henry Mintzberg, who was the great definer of what leadership looked like in the 1980s with his books on Mintzberg on management, etc. One of the observations he made was that the male leaders he worked with tended to treat their home and their private life as a kind of branch office. Because they were so compartmentalized, and he saw that as fragility because they didn't know who they were once they were out of their jobs. So now, as we move into a time of much more rapid change, and the pandemic has forced people, here I am at home. I just told the construction guys building a new bathroom window they had to leave before this started. So
I am too.
People are sequestering their dogs and hanging up their phones and asking their partner to be silent for a certain amount of time. So it's all jumbled together. We can't keep it separate anymore. So that facility and ability to draw from the whole broad range of your identity and who you are is really key.
Absolutely. I love that. And I want you to, before we do that, let me just encourage folks. We have a few minutes. These things go very, very fast. So if you want to ask a question to Sally, please put it in the chat box and I will try to get to your questions. But Sally, one of the things that I am concerned about, and I think a lot of us are really pondering right now, is as the pandemic winds down, And as we so-called go back to, I'm concerned about even using the word BACK, as we return to sort of life as we knew it, how do you recommend coaches in particular who are working with leaders who are trying to figure out hybrid lifestyles and work worlds, and are we going to go back to the office, and all of those kinds of questions? How can we make sure that all of this improvement and expansion towards the kind of equitable, balanced, more open, diverse, and inclusive, open in one way, but inclusive in other ways, environment remains? How do we make sure that we keep the benefits that we have garnered through this difficult period?
I think one of the best ways that, again, coaches and people who are in leadership development, it really pays to work, and what you said about not going back, we are not going back, we are going forward. The whole paradigm of the organization of the industrial workplace, which we were carting around when it was 60 years technologically out of date, that's what the pandemic has exploded. That's a huge thing. That's really a big deal. And it's going to take a period of time to adjust to that and to understand what kinds of practices are going to be required. And where I see companies that are not doing a particularly adaptive job, leaders who are not doing an adaptive job, it's either let's get back, no, there's no going back, we have to carve a way forward. Or there's, okay, here's what we're going to set. Here's the timeline we're going to enforce. Well, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we cannot enforce timelines. That timelines are constantly being determined by circumstance. And it could be the circumstance of the pandemic or some of its results, like, incredible issues in the supply chain, et cetera. And how are we going to deal with that? So setting arbitrary timelines is really a bad practice. I was very encouraged. I read a fascinating interview with the chair of Tata Corp, which is co-based in Mumbai, London. And he was saying that Tata has been an early adapter in terms of work from home. They see huge they see huge potential benefits in terms of the amount of attention that they've had to bring to the visa process in the past, in the whole work from home. And he was saying that he can't exactly speculate, but that he guesses that by 2030, which of course is just around the corner, that 70% of their people will be primarily working from home.
Wow.
But he said, we don't know. We don't know how this is going to play out. So we're trying to learn from individual efforts, from small scale efforts, from communities that are doing it well. We're trying to keep our ears to the ground as we discover what they're doing. And you know what this reminded me of? The web of inclusion. And the way in which, that chapter in the web of inclusion, change doesn't work like an ink stain, with, the company Intel being willing to learn from what some very small marketing divisions were doing to address some major strategic challenges they had, and then try them out. That's what I believe the leaders who navigate this successfully will do. They'll look around, they'll look at what different people are doing, they'll get information about it, and they'll say, okay, let's try that over here. Let's give that a shot over there, rather than making these pronouncements. Here's the timeline. This is what we're going to do. It's unrealistic in this environment. And it comes off as way too top down, given the autonomy people have gotten used to during this.
Yeah, I love that. One of my clients is a software company, Dropbox, and they recently they were trying to decide whether to be hybrid, go back to the office, virtual. And they asked their employees, they went to see where they were being highly productive, and they discovered that their most highly productive teams were virtual and hybrid, and they basically made a policy for the whole company that people can decide on their own. Yes. Teams can decide on their own. It's like really distributing power and saying we're no longer going to just sit at the top in the C-suite and decide what goes on. We're going to listen to where things really work and then go from there. So that is exactly what you're pointing to, is it doesn't have to be top down. It can actually be bottom up, because some of the best high performing teams are actually distributed below the top. They know more about what's really going on in the world, right?
Yes, exactly. And so I think that's coaches will do well by taking that approach, rather than, I'm going to help you figure out what your timeline is going to be. Let's talk about how you can gain better information in the organization about what's working and what isn't.
And we're getting this amazing question that I've always wanted to ask you, because I actually use your book with a number of my introverted male clients. So I'm curious what Dr. Janice Thompson is asking. How do you use your book with men, or do you recommend using it with men? And how do you bring it up? What's the way you enter that conversation?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and really relates to the experience I've had with this book and my own learning journey with it. When the book came out, my idea was this is going to be useful for men to help them understand some of the habits that get in the way of their valued female employees, and create cultures in which those internal barriers are addressed. So that was my idea, top-down idea of the author. From day one, I started hearing from men who said, I'm an engineer, I'm an accountant, I'm an introvert, I'm not one of these super extrovert, super confident guys out there. And I identify with that, with a number of the habits in this book, particularly things like overvaluing expertise,
Right.
and putting your job before your career. So that was such a learning to me. I had a chief compliance officer at one of the most high-profile companies in the entire world come up to me, a man, and say, the behavior that really resonated for me here was the disease to please.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm finding, what I'm hearing from coaches is exactly that they are using that. And the way I'm describing that is, to some degree, the premise of How Women Rise was drawn from Marshall's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which was about the habits and behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful people as they move into leadership positions. What I noticed in Marshall's book is that the habits that he was describing were not necessarily the habits that I encountered with the women I've been working with for the last 32 years now. So I suggested we collaborate and do this book. And it was, based on the experience that I've had working with women, and some of the experience he's had working with women. But remember, Marshall's client base was, really, really highly visible male CEOs, primarily, about 80%. So I've come now to think of this book, certainly it's about habits that hold women back. And that is very, very true. But I also think of it as the habits that got left out of Marshall's book because of the population he was dealing with. And that
not all men fit that profile.
Exactly. Things like the habit. I think the one that really, there were two that made me think we've got to do a different book for women. One was learn to apologize. Okay. No, that's most women need to learn to stop apologizing. But the other was stop always talking about how great you are. Well, this is not, something that is widely characteristic of men, particularly more introverted men. They're not walking in and saying, well, I had the answer to this and I did that, and that kind of obnoxious behavior. So I think it's very useful for them, and I find that it's helpful to explain it in that context, as kind of some of the habits that got left out of What Got You Here, which was extremely valuable and relevant in so many ways, and particularly for a population of what Tommaso Premuzic Chamorro calls overconfident male leaders.
Right. Which is a perfect segue to take the last few minutes and give you an opportunity, because I've had the privilege of actually reading your preliminary proposal, which you graciously shared with me because I need help writing proposals. And your next book is going to be so amazing. And I just want you to give the audience a tease, because it is basically taking that next level perspective on how it's not male, it's not female, it's everyone. So speak to us a little bit about what we can expect in Rising Together, I can say the title.
Exactly. What I want to work with here is how men and women can collaborate to build the next best workplace, which is the post-pandemic workplace that we have been discussing. And it's really based on that fundamental premise that the industrial workplace that we've all been kind of adjusting to has been, to some extent, relegated to the past because of how the pandemic made us work. So what I'm looking at there is the kind of inclusive behaviors that create organizations in which everyone can reach their full potential and feel that they have at least the possibility of thriving. What are those inclusive behaviors? I find that more helpful than hunting for unconscious biases, which are more internal. And I also find, and this is important for coaching, that people are more likely to change their thinking based on new experiences because of different behaviors than they are likely to change their thinking first and then begin acting in different ways. It also looks, and this is a lot of fun, but kind of controversial, at some of the triggers that really hold men and women back from being their best selves at work. Perceptions about, oh, it's not fair, which both women and men can have in different kinds of ways. Different ways of handling things like humor and attraction. These are tough to write about. How difference in managing perceptions and pursuing visibility. What are those factors that can really trigger some of these uncomfortable dynamics, and how do we address them and put that conversation on the table, and then drawing from that, developing more inclusive habits and really defining what those are and holding leaders to account for following through on that. So I'm very hopeful about this. It's been difficult. It's been hard to define and get my arms around, but I feel like I now have the right title, the right approach, the right team behind me, the right, just the right timing on this, and having an amazing time doing some of the interviews for this book.
Well, I am super excited about it because, when I think of your work, I think of it as an analogy, like the best coaches take, and the reason I'm involved with the Institute of Coaching, who's sponsoring this conversation, is that we take the science of coaching, the evidence, the research, and try to apply it to the real world, because we're actually working with clients. Right. And that's what the best coaches do. And I think of your work as almost like a cultural anthropologist. You're looking at very, very sensitive and deep narratives that many of us just take for granted in terms of the way we as humans interact with each other in organizations. And, it's one thing to read about the studies of females or males within an organization in an academic setting. It's another to see you pull out the gems that can actually make people aware of these narratives that no longer apply, that we're still very enmeshed in, like attractiveness or don't use humor or whatever it is. And so I'm really excited because you are one of those rare individuals that can translate things that people are not aware of into the real world. And that's where, like you said, the behavior, it's what we see, it's what we do, it's what we experience, not just what we read. And so I am thrilled that this book is coming. I can't wait. I hope it's soon. But I know you'll start talking about it. So I'm sure that everyone will hear more about it. And thank you for giving us a little future insights into what we can expect.
Yeah, it's
believe it, we are already out of time. These things fly by, and I'm sorry because people are now throwing questions like crazy. So we will save the questions.
Good.
So that we can share them with Sally, and hopefully she'll take the time to get back to people on LinkedIn. And I just want to thank you, Sally, for taking the time to be with us today. It's a privilege for me as a friend, as a colleague. And I also just want to remind everyone that we're doing these every 2 weeks. And my colleague Alicia will be doing an amazing interview 2 weeks from now on the 30th of June and Wednesday at noon with a Harvard nutritional psychiatrist named Uma Naidu, and talking about how nutrition impacts our mental health. So stay tuned for that. And thank you all for joining us from around the world. It's been a pleasure, and keep your eye out for Sally's new book, Rising Together. It will be soon, right, Sally?
No, it won't be soon. It's due in February, so it'll probably be February 2023.
That's right around the corner.
It is. It feels right around the corner to me.
Well, I look forward to it. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. A pleasure.
Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.